I'm going to take this from my new Swedish friend, which is good dog. I think I'm saying that right. But good afternoon, everyone. My name is Remy Lyle, and today I'm going to talk about Kondo-ing and what that means, API authorizations. And I feel like I'm so loud. I'm going to try and tone it down. So my name's Remy. I am American, in case you guys can't tell from my accent. I am from the beautiful state of Colorado in the US. I've been in the identity and access management space for the last 15 years. And currently I work for Ping Identity as part of the global technical enablement team. If you guys haven't had a chance to stop by the Ping booth and learn a little bit about us, I highly encourage you to do so. I promise we're friendly. We even have candy. But if you haven't had a chance to know anything about Ping, suffice to say that at the heart of what we want to do is connect the right identities to the right applications. And what's interesting about that is the definition of applications, I think, has really shifted from the time of Ping's inception in 2002 to what we would define as applications now in 2019. I think being surrounded by all of these fabulous API enthusiasts, we could probably go so far to say that APIs are at the heart of those new applications. And so, they're the next frontier for identity and security. And so Ping wants to be at the forefront of that, solving that problem, which is connecting the right identities to the right applications and APIs. So, fun fact about me, and hopefully you recognize the last name, which is the title of my presentation, but Marie Kondo is a personal hero. I don't know how many of you guys actually have heard of Marie Kondo? A few? Okay, good. So if you haven't heard of her, she started off writing a best-selling book called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And a few book deals later and a hit Netflix show later, she is all over the US. But she is known as the tidying and organizational expert. So if you need some tidying and decluttering, I highly recommend you guys watch her show or read her book. What I find fascinating about Marie is the fact that she has been able to transform people's lives for the better. They have better sleep, they have better energy, they have better relationships, all because they have taken the time to, sort of declutter and organize the physical messes of their lives. One of her signature questions is, does it spark joy? And what I want to take away from that is it provides people with a simple enough method and a guilt-free method, to be honest, to declutter, and it's kind of a fresh new approach to organizing and tidying up and decluttering. So all of you might look at me like I'm crazy, which sometimes I can be, but for API authorizations, what? So when putting so I put a link in the Wall Street Journal article, which I think validates the fact that Marie Kondo is officially a verb in the English language. So when you say Kondo-ing, it really just means like organizing. So I thought, well, is there a way that we can apply Marie Kondo organizational type principles, but instead apply them to API authorizations? That's my shtick. So, all right, so let's take a look at an API here. So, I think what's interesting is that, there's a lot of talk of authorization at the, sort of the authorization server level, but I want to kind of look at it from a resource server perspective. So here I have an API. Presumably you show up with some kind of token or key, and this API example, you're just, you're making a GET call and you're getting some data. And so when, as the API publisher, when you build this API, are you really just returning some data? Are you really? Or are there some things you kind of need to think about? So let's take a deeper look. So I think we've heard in the security talks today, there's a lot of talk around scope values. Yes, I listened to the talk today. I was like, all right, I guess I'll change from scopes to scope values. But you have to, take that into, that's one of the factors, the authorization factors that you have to consider when somebody shows up to your API saying, hey, I have this particular scope value. What does that mean? Is it permissions-based? Does that mean that I give you access to the data? Does it mean, what does it mean, right? So it's an authorization layer. And what about the claims that have come in? Do I look at that? I think what's interesting is that there's, from an authorization perspective, the point of view is, I give you the token, it has the claims, it has the scopes. All right, API publisher, have fun. Like, you can figure it out as far as authorization goes, right? So for the publishers, these are, again, things that when you look at it, okay, what does this mean as far as how I actually respond back to this particular API request? What about privacy preferences? If you think about the scenario where users' privacy preferences might not be in flight as part of an authentication request, what if it's stored in a database or a directory somewhere? How do you take that into consideration for authorizations and when returning data? Another big one is user consent. And consent here, consent is like a whole nother talk, honestly. I feel like consent is one of those things that you ask somebody what a consent means to them and you get like definitions from it. But what I mean when I say consent is I'm specifically thinking of, like, for example, in the US, there's a new FHIR healthcare API standard. But the idea is that, as a patient, do I consent to the physician? So it's multi-party consent. Do I consent to my physician accessing, my health records? Do I consent to my spouse? Maybe we're not getting along, or maybe we are. Maybe I don't want them to see my data. So it's that type of consent. So again, you have to take these into consideration when you're returning the data. And if you choose to ignore all of this, maybe you can't because you're going to suffer a huge fine, potentially jail time, or bad press. I don't know which one's the worst. But you have to look at the data regulations that surround you returning the data and making sure that you're in compliance. Another one is the adoption of zero trust. So there's this notion that, the perimeter lines are really blurred and I don't know what's in the network, what's out of the network. Point is, I don't trust anybody and I don't want to just release my data responses willy-nilly. All right, so we have our API. We look at all of these different layers, at least in this specific example, and we say, okay, I think I have it covered. Except, how many do I have? And so, from a publisher perspective, it's really, it becomes a problem of scale. There's a whole ecosystem of your APIs and how they relate to each other, and there's chain reactions, especially in a microservices type architecture where the kind of data that's outputted from one API affects another. And so it looks like Marie Kondo's least favorite thing, which is a mess. So what do we do? The reality is that data is always going to be detailed and complex. And APIs today are the modern day versions of your generic data sources, right? That's just a fact. It's everywhere. It's accessed in many ways. You have a lot of different stakeholders. You have an ever-changing landscape of regulations that you need to consider. And again, fact of the matter is that it's going to be subjected to different layers of authorization decisions. Well, how are we doing? I don't know. How many of you guys have heard of OWASP? Are you guys familiar? Oh, wonderful. So I don't have to introduce them. They've been around since 2001. And if you take a look at their 2019 top API security risk, the #1 security risk for APIs is broken authorization. API authorization is the top security risk as per OWASP, which apparently all of you know of. And so the idea behind that is that, the publishers just aren't building in the necessary object level checks. And I think Jacob even highlighted this in his presentation when he said, token based authorization is not enough. You had an example of where you could just, change the ID and then you could obviously glean data from other sources that you weren't meant to. Number 3 is excessive data exposure. And I believe David covered this in the previous talk today, if you guys attended that too. But the idea is that as publishers, we tend to genericize the data that we get back. I mean, it's the easiest. I mean, devs are always going to take the easiest path. But they don't consider the sensitivity and as it relates to the clients that are actually receiving the data, the consumers of the data. And so the issue is that as soon as that data is exposed, the traffic is sniffed, you get more data than you should be getting. And again, the traffic is sniffed. So just to illustrate my own research and personal what I found kind of looking into the actual consequences. So in 2018, Mozilla Foundation researcher, so in the US, Venmo is pretty big. I think here in Sweden, I think it's something different. But Venmo is a peer-to-peer payment application. And Venmo was relying on the consumers of their API and the client side to filter out the user data before, but unfortunately, what ended up happening is that when you sniff that traffic, you can actually scrape off user information from those APIs. And it was able to reveal 208 million transactions and build purchase profiles of its users. So you can imagine that, if I'm an attacker and I'm sniffing out the API traffic and you're giving me so much data and I sort of harvest that and start building profiles about you, that leads into other security attacks such as spear phishing, which is, I give my friend tickets for Miley Cyrus concerts, which I would never do, or some other concert. You can, then potentially build emails that say, hey, do you want VIP concert tickets? I click on the link because I'm so excited about VIP tickets, and next thing you know, you've taken over my account and stolen all my money, and I'm homeless, and no one loves me. So very much real-life consequences here. And so who is responsible? Is it really the publishers? Should we put the onus on them? I mean, the reality is it just doesn't scale. From a resource server perspective, how can, and actually OWASP has already proven that publishers just aren't building in the object level checks that are necessary to control, authorization to the data. So we can't rely on them. Can we rely on consumers? Well, OWASP's #1 recommendation against excessive data exposure is to never rely on your consumers to filter your data. That is just a reality. We also can't rely on consumers. Now, if only we knew somebody who knew how to organize things, enter in Marie Kondo, a tidying layer. So this is what I want. This is where I kind of want to shift your guys' thinking. So imagine if you had a tidying layer in between your publishers and your consumers, to where you were decoupling authorization from implementation of the API. And in your, what I'll just call Marie Kondo layer, that is where you'll take into account all the scopes that have come in, all the claims that have come in. You might reach out to some additional sources for, privacy, preferences, and consent. And then allowing that to be arranged into business-defined policies. Again, decoupling the authorization from the implementation of the API. So let's take a deeper look at this. So kind of zoning in on this left-hand side. So again, there's many different layers of authorization. And so I listed some of them here. And they could come from databases, they could come from directories, and they could even come from potentially other APIs. And this is a challenge that, how do you do this today, right? So instead of, you having to build that into your, at the individual API level for your entire API ecosystem, again, what if we pulled all of that authorization information into one central Marie Kondo layer? Again, pulling in from any source, any state, any attribute, any authorization data source. And what if we allowed those sources to be then grouped together and reusable? Imagine that. We can reuse this across and have our business help define those policies, if not the business defining these policies. I'm kind of a little leery of the fact that business can truly define it, so I put architects just in case, just to be safe. But imagine that your architects and your business are the ones to combine all of these authorization sources together, build policies out of that, so that you can reuse these policies across your different APIs and be so much more efficient about it. And this is also a very interesting concept. So from a consumer perspective, imagine that this two consumers consuming the same API with their own tokens, but receiving different attribute level values, like true fine-grained access authorization to where it's down to the attribute level. They're making the same call, but they're potentially getting back different data depending on your authorization layer and what rules you've coded. Potentially, you could have something that allows, blocks, filter, or obfuscates that data. So I like to present you guys with the notion of an API layer that enforces fine-grained access control that allows your, let me flip back here, that allows your publishers to continue genericizing their data sources, implement the API, don't worry about the authorization piece, yet have consumers consume the response as is without having to worry about filtering the data themselves. And Marie Kondo is very happy and that we've organized our life. And so just to kind of wrap up here, the benefits, I think, and I think we've covered a lot of this, but the benefits of decoupling authorization from implementation. And actually, what I want you guys to think about is this. So I've been in the identity access management space. This whole concept of decoupling authorization from implementation is nothing new. We've actually been doing this for web-based applications, like legacy web-based applications. And now it's interesting to take that same concept and apply it at an API perspective. So removing your API publishers from managing authorization at the individual API level, removing your API consumers from filtering the data themselves, reducing your risk, centralizing your authorization decisions, looking up multiple sources of authorization data, wherever your privacy preferences are at, wherever your consents are at, implementing and adopting to zero trust, in which you trust no one with your response, and so you're going to do the filtering instead of letting clients and consumers do that for you, and really enforcing dynamic authorization and attribute by attribute access control. So as I near my talk, I hope this was a new perspective for you guys. Marie Kondo changed people's lives with the concept of organization by allowing people to transform their cluttered spaces into places of serenity, inspiration. So I like to leave you with this question. Does your API authorization model spark joy? So thank you so much. That's all I have for today. And we'll have those other speakers.